Imagine a convicted murderer, a man who strangled an 18-year-old woman with her own bra, beat her with an iron bar, and left her naked body in the woods. Now imagine that same man becoming a beloved celebrity, a best-selling author, a television personality, a respected journalist who interviews police chiefs about murders, the very murders he's committing. In 1990, Austrian intellectuals, including a Nobel Prize winner, successfully campaigned to free Jack Unterweger from prison. They called him rehabilitated, a shining example of redemption, proof that anyone could change. Within 4 months of his release, he murdered again. And he didn't stop. For nearly 2 years, Jack Unterweger lived a double life. By day, celebrated writer, charming talk show guest, investigative journalist. By night, predator who hunted sex workers across 3 countries, strangling them with ligatures fashioned from their own undergarments. He stayed at the infamous Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. The LAPD gave him ride-alongs through red light districts, unknowingly showing him where to find his next victims. He reported on his own crimes, interviewed detectives hunting for himself, became the story he was covering. This is the story of Johann Jack Unterweger, the poet of death, the man who fooled an entire nation, the serial killer who weaponized redemption. Johann Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in Judenburg, Austria. His mother, Theresia, was a teenager, a barmaid and waitress with a criminal record for fraud, theft, and forgery. His father was an American GI stationed in Europe after World War II. They reportedly met in Trieste. The American soldier disappeared before Jack was born. His mother was in prison when she was pregnant with him, jailed for fraud but released before giving birth. Theresia couldn't or wouldn't care for her son. Before Jack was 2 years old, she abandoned him to his maternal grandfather in Carinthia. Unterweger's step-grandmother also lived in the home for a number of years, but Jack would later claim something more disturbing, that he had to share a bed with his alcoholic, violent grandfather and whatever women the old man brought home. Whether this was true or another one of Jack's manipulations, we'll never know. But what's certain is that his childhood was marked by violence, abandonment, and chaos. He was drinking alcohol by age 5, fighting before age 10. His mother's arrest resulted in a deep-seated hatred for sex workers that would define Unterweger's own criminal history. Unterweger would later claim his mother was a sex worker herself, and that his aunt, also a prostitute, had been murdered by a customer when he was a teenager. These stories may have been lies, they may have been true, but they became Jack's justification, his explanation, his excuse. By the time he was a teenager, Unterweger had an extensive criminal record, including the assault of a sex worker. Prison couldn't hold him. He'd serve short sentences, get released, commit more crimes. Assault, robbery, pimping, rape. Between 1971 and 1974, Unterweger was convicted of 4 counts of rape and assault, receiving 3 years imprisonment. But rape wasn't enough anymore. On December 1974, everything escalated. In December 1974, Unterweger and his girlfriend, Barbara Schultz, kidnapped and murdered an 18-year-old named Margaret Schaefer. Schaefer was walking along a road near Uersbach, Germany, when Unterweger approached her. He propositioned her for sex. She refused. What happened next would become Jack Unterweger's signature. He bludgeoned her with an iron bar. He strangled her with her own bra, tying it into intricate knots. He left her naked body in the woods. At his trial, he told prosecutors he pictured Schaefer as his mother when he was killing her. Even then, Jack was performing, creating his narrative, telling the story that would garner sympathy. Barbara Schultz testified against him. She was tried as an accomplice and received 8 years imprisonment. On June 1, 1976, Unterweger was sentenced to life in prison. He was 25 years old. By Austrian law, he would have to serve a minimum of 15 years before being eligible for parole. Most people who knew him assumed he'd die behind bars. They were wrong. Something happened to Jack Unterweger in prison, or rather, something appeared to happen. Though he was largely uneducated, Unterweger began teaching himself to read and write. He started with simple poems, then short stories, then plays, and then, in 1984, he wrote an autobiography, Fegefeuer oder die Reise ins Zuchthaus, Purgatory or the Journey to Prison, told the story of a troubled youth who committed a terrible crime in a moment of madness, but who had found redemption through literature and self-reflection. It was beautifully written, raw, emotional, compelling, and Austria fell in love with it. The book became a bestseller. It later served as the basis for a 1988 film adaptation. Suddenly, Jack Unterweger wasn't just a murderer. He was a Hafenliterat, Austrian vernacular for jail writer, often translated as Jack the Writer, as a play on Jack the Ripper. Austrian intellectuals rallied around him. They saw him as proof that the prison system could work, that rehabilitation was real, that even a murderer could be redeemed through art. Nobel Prize winner Elfriede Jelinek championed his cause. So did influential editor Alfred Kolarich and journalist Peter Humer. Upon his release, Purgatory was taught in Austrian schools, and his stories for children were performed on Austrian radio. A campaign formed, Free Jack Unterweger. He was their reclamation project, their social experiment, their civilized barbarian. On May 23, 1990, after serving exactly 15 years, the minimum required by law, Jack Unterweger walked free. The prison governor declared, "We will never find a prisoner so well prepared for freedom." Within 4 months, the killing began again. September 14, 1990, less than 4 months after his release. Jack Unterweger traveled to Prague, Czechoslovakia. He was there ostensibly to research the city's red light district for a magazine article. While in Prague, he met 30-year-old butcher shop employee Blanka Bočková. Bočkova's body was found the next morning near the Vltava River, with signs of both manual and ligature strangulation. She had been strangled with her own underwear. The knots were intricate, distinctive, identical to those used on Margaret Schaefer in 1974. Back in Austria, Jack Unterweger was everywhere. He gave readings at bookstores. He appeared on talk shows. He hosted television programs about criminal rehabilitation. He worked as a journalist for the public broadcaster ORF. Women adored him. He was handsome, charismatic, articulate. He wore fashionable clothing, often a distinctive brown leather jacket and red scarf. But some female journalists who routinely worked with him said they believed he hated women and were confused why so many women rallied around him. And in the shadows, women were dying. Between October 1990 and May 1991, Unterweger killed at least 7 women in Austria. October 1990, Brunhilde Masser, 39, murdered in Graz. December 1990, Heidi Hammerer, 31, killed in Bregenz. March 1991, Elfriede Schrempf, 35, found strangled in Graz. The victims followed a pattern. They were sex workers, 2 of whom were unregistered, with several of them having been previously solicited by Unterweger. All were strangled with their own undergarments, fashioned into that signature knot. All were dumped in forests outside Vienna and other Austrian cities. The press called him the Vienna Woods Killer. Many of his victims were murdered and dumped in wooded areas in remote parts of Vienna. and Jack Unterweger. He was covering the story. He reported on stories concerning the very murders for which he was later found guilty. He interviewed Max Edelbacher, the head of Vienna's Special Crime Unit, asking probing questions about the investigation. He seemed to be a nice guy. I trusted him, and this was my great mistake, Edelbacher later said. Jack wrote articles criticizing the police for their failure to catch the killer, all while knowing exactly who the killer was, because it was him. In summer 1991, Unterweger was hired by an Austrian magazine to write about crime in Los Angeles and the differences between U.S. and European attitudes to prostitution. Jack was thrilled. Los Angeles, the city of angels, the murder capital of America, home to Hollywood glamour and downtown squalor, and Jack knew exactly where he wanted to stay. In Los Angeles, Unterweger checked into the infamous Cecil Hotel. The Cecil, a decaying downtown Los Angeles hotel with a dark history. In 1985, serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had stayed there while terrorizing the city. It is suspected, but was never proven, that he chose the Cecil because of its connection to Ramirez. Jack was making a pilgrimage. He met local police, even going so far as to participate in a ride-along in the city's red light districts. Think about that. The LAPD, one of the most famous police departments in the world, gave a convicted murderer a guided tour of where sex workers congregated. They showed him the exact streets, the exact corners, the exact areas where vulnerable women worked. It's ugly, it's dirty, it's scary. You could die every time you get in a car, one woman hauntingly told Unterweger in one of his interview recordings. Every time you drive away, you don't know if he's going to kill you. She was talking to her own future murderer. During time in Los Angeles and Malibu, Unterweger beat, raped, and murdered 3 sex workers. 35-year-old Shannon Exley on June 20th, 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez on June 28th, and 26-year-old Peggy Jean Booth, also known as Sherry Ann Long, on July 3rd. The killings were linked by the distinct way the bras of the victims were cut and tied into a granny knot to be more suitable for controlled asphyxiation. Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, Peggy Jean Booth, 3 women with names, lives, families. 3 women who deserved better than to become footnotes in Jack Unterweger's story. All 3 were found beaten and strangled in the Hollywood Hills and Malibu, their bodies discarded like trash. While in L.A., Jack also attempted to meet celebrities. He tried to visit Zsa Zsa Gabor's home. He approached Austrian-American director Robert Dornhelm, trying to convince him to produce a new film based on his autobiography. In both cases, he had apparently just sauntered up to their doors. The audacity, the confidence, the absolute certainty that he could get away with anything. After 5 weeks in Los Angeles, Jack Unterweger returned to Austria. He'd killed 3 women, and he'd have a hell of a magazine article to show for it. By late 1991, Austrian police were connecting the dots. Retired investigator August Schenner had worked a case in the 1970s, murders of women with a similar M.O. Schenner recalled telling police that Unterweger was one of the cleverest criminals in Austria. After Unterweger's release, Schenner heard reports of murders in Vienna in 1990 and recognized several parallels to the 1974 murders. Police began surveillance. They tracked his movements, his credit cards, his rental cars, and patterns emerged. Unterweger had been in Graz when Brunhilde Masser disappeared, in Bregenz when Heidi Hammerer vanished, in Vienna when multiple women were killed. A witness also testified that Unterweger was similar to a man she had seen with Hammerer just before she disappeared, and that he had been wearing a brown leather jacket and red scarf. Then came the forensic breakthrough. Dr. Ernst Geiger was able to carry out forensic tests on a BMW that Unterweger had bought on his release from prison. A hair fragment was found and DNA tests proved that it belonged to Blanka Bokova, the first victim from Prague. Investigators were able to find hair from both Unterweger and Bokova on the seat of a car, which was found in a garage in Linz. In Unterweger's Vienna apartment, police found the brown leather jacket and red scarf. They found receipts from a Malibu seafood restaurant. They found home snapshots of Unterweger posing with female members of the Los Angeles Police Department. And they found business cards, LAPD business cards, from the officers who had taken him on that ride-along. LAPD was notified. They immediately connected the dots. 3 sex workers murdered during the exact time frame of Unterweger's visit, all strangled with their bras, all bearing that distinctive knot. The intricate tight knot on the victim's undergarments helped investigators connect the Austrian and Los Angeles victims to the perpetrator. Jack Unterweger was wanted for murder on 2 continents. When police came to arrest him in Austria, Jack was gone. He fled with his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bianca Marak, through Switzerland, through Paris, eventually to Miami, Florida. Success magazine offered $10,000 for an on-the-run interview, but it was a setup. The editor informed police of the USA money exchange location in Miami Beach, where Unterweger would be picking up the wired advance. On February 27, 1992, federal agents arrested Jack Unterweger in Miami Beach. The poet of death was going back to prison. The LAPD was hoping to prosecute him for the 3 Los Angeles murders, but at the time DNA evidence was slow, and Unterweger was extradited to Austria to be charged with his killings there before he could be charged with the U.S. murders. California had the death penalty. Austria did not. Jack Unterweger's trial began in Graz, Austria, in April 1994. It lasted 2 months. The courtroom was packed. Media from around the world attended. Some women wept during the proceedings, believing Unterweger to be an innocent victim. Even at trial, Jack's charm still worked on some people. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The DNA from Blanka Bokova's hair in his car, the red fibers from his scarf found on victim Brunhilde Masser's body, the ligature knots, identical across all victims, from Margaret Schaefer in 1974 to Peggy Jean Booth in Los Angeles in 1991. Credit card receipts and rental car records placing him at each murder location. Witness testimony from sex workers who had been with him before victims disappeared. "I'm counting on your acquittal," Unterweger said during the trial, "because I am not the culprit. Your decision will affect not only me but the real killer, who is laughing up his sleeve. Still performing, still manipulating, still telling his story." But this time, no one believed him. On June 29, 1994, Unterweger was found guilty in 1994 of murdering 9 prostitutes after a 2-month-long trial in Graz. Jack Unterweger was found guilty of 9 counts of murder. The Prague victim, all 3 Los Angeles victims, and 5 in Austria. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "I cannot bear going back into a cell," Unterweger had said after his capture. That night, Jack Unterweger kept his word. That night, Unterweger hanged himself in prison. He used a ligature, the same kind of knot he'd used to kill all those women. He tied the ligature, Richard Chauvet told investigators. The signature ligature by which he killed all the prostitutes in Los Angeles and Vienna. That was his confession. One Austrian politician dryly quipped that it was Unterweger's best murder. In the wake of Jack Unterweger's death, The people who had championed his release faced a reckoning. At the time, I genuinely believed that Unterweger was a reformed man, said Peter Humer, but now I feel I was deceived and that I am partly to blame. The intellectuals who had rallied for his freedom, who had called him rehabilitated, who had used him as proof that anyone could change, had to face the truth. They had been manipulated by a master manipulator. They had been charmed by a psychopath. They had freed a killer, and at least 11 more women had died as a result. The official victim count stands at 12. Margaret Schaefer, 1974. Blanka Bokova, Prague, 1990. Brunhilde Masser, Austria, 1990. Heidi Hammerer, Austria, 1990. Elfriede Schrempf, Austria, 1991. Sylvia Zagler, Austria, 1991. Sabine Moitzi, Austria, 1991. Regina Prem, Austria, 1991. Karen Eroglu Sladky, Austria, 1991. Shannon Exley, Los Angeles, 1991. Irene Rodriguez, Los Angeles, 1991. Peggy Jean Booth, Los Angeles, 1991. But investigators suspect there may have been more. Women who disappeared and were never found. Bodies dumped in remote locations that were never discovered. By the end of his life, no one in Austrian history had been accused of as many murders as him. So, what can we learn from Jack Unterweger? First, charm is not evidence of reform. Psychopaths are often the most charismatic people in any room. They can mimic empathy, fake remorse, perform redemption. Second, we want to believe in redemption so badly that we'll ignore warning signs. The Austrian intellectuals weren't stupid. They were hopeful. And Unterweger weaponized that hope. Third, the system failed. Unterweger was convicted of 4 counts of rape and assault between 1971 and 1974, receiving 3 years imprisonment before the Schaefer murder. He was already a serial rapist. He was already escalating, and yet he was released to kill again. And finally, some people cannot be rehabilitated. Not every criminal can be saved. Some killers will always be killers, no matter how beautifully they write, no matter how convincingly they perform contrition. Jack Unterweger proved that the hard way. The Cecil Hotel still stands in downtown Los Angeles. It's been rebranded, renovated, but its dark history lingers. Richard Ramirez stayed there. Jack Unterweger stayed there. Elisa Lam died there. Some places seem to attract darkness, or perhaps darkness leaves an echo. Jack Unterweger's story continues to fascinate. A Peacock documentary series featured him. Michael Fassbender is slated to play him in an upcoming film called Entering Hades. But in all the fascination with the killer, we must remember there were victims. 12 women, possibly more, who died because society decided a charming sociopath deserved a second chance. They deserved better. This has been the story of Jack Unterweger, the poet of death. If this deep dive into one of history's most manipulative killers moved you, please like and subscribe to Echoes of Darkness. Remember, not everyone who claims to be reformed actually is. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we trust the most. Stay vigilant.